Patty.
Well, hello, everybody. Today on Sunday, 26 September 2021, Global Technopolitics Forum's research meeting. So as some of you know, we're almost publishing 5G projects, and Paul has some comments to make. So Paul, why don't you start with your comments?
Okay, so I'll be quick about this, or brief. So I thought on the good side, I thought it was quite well structured. It was written in a clear way, very coherent, good overview of the technology, some of the geopolitical issues. That was very accurately done and concise. A number of good examples, especially the Latin America cases. I thought that was well done. Three areas I thought for consideration, but maybe at this point, I don't know if it's possible to accommodate or not, but I mentioned them. So one is about what I would call the context or bigger picture. The other one I would call is value added or points of value. And the third area is areas that were uncovered. So if I look at the larger picture, so I thought it was sort of valuable to consider the 5G issues within a larger context. So the 5G standards, geopolitical issues, it was all considered within this high-tech realm, but actually it fits into a much larger picture of geopolitical strategy, whether it's China or other countries, about for example, involvement in standards organizations. So China getting involved in some of these technology or 5G related standard organizations is just a reflection of a much broader strategy, which sees China becoming much more active and taking much more aggressive role in things like the WHO, the World Economic Forum, ITU. I mean, so there are all these other organizations, and I think there's some value to thinking about 5G within this larger strategic context. When I talked about areas that I thought could have been capitalized on, there were a couple of cases in the paper where the statement was, well, you know, this could be an interesting thing in the future, but today it's difficult to predict how this will go. You know, there's a talk about 5G. So, you know, who will have control of 5G, what the environment will look like. But to me, that's actually indeed the value of the paper would be, you know, to sort of think about and speculate on what would that future look like. So it's okay to describe what the current situation is. But I think the real value add is what do we imagine that future could look like, and maybe even sketch out 2 or 3 potential scenarios. The third one, when I talk about areas that were uncovered, I sort of thought one area that strikes me is important, and I mentioned this earlier on when the paper was in development, is this whole idea of technical talent. Like, where's the talent coming from? It's okay to talk about the technology, but ultimately it's people who are behind the technology. And what is China doing? What is the US doing? What is that to sort of ensure that they have enough, what I would call bench strength, if I can call it that, to ensure that they have future, you know, a future leg up or some position in the 5G realm and even other technologies. But, you know, there's a big shift going on at this point in the educational realm about Chinese students, if we think about from that perspective, studying in Australia, studying in the US, a lot of concerns, a lot of restraints. So both those countries thinking about restricting Chinese students coming to the US, and China itself saying, we don't want our students going to those places. So does China have the educational wherewithal at this point? Do they have the environment to train the next generation of talent to be able to continue to support and sustain this technology drive that they've got in mind and that they've envisioned? So that relates directly to 5G, but also to some of these other developments that are going on. The other thing is that the 5G paper is pretty much focused on network, you know, core network equipment, right? So it's all about these telecommunications networks. But as the paper itself points out, it's a much bigger ecosystem. So that includes anything from the devices, the handsets that are being used to access these networks by individuals, but also all these things that relate to IoT. So that is a whole can of worms right there about, you know, who's jockeying for what standards in those areas. You know, they do tangentially connect to and relate to these 5G networks. Anyway, so those are just three areas I thought, you know, perhaps could be invested in. Maybe it's not the right time to consider that at this point in the paper's development. A couple of points that I thought could be changed and perhaps, you know, augmented quite easily. There's a point, I don't know what page it was because I didn't see numbers, but there's a point talking about contracts, comparing 5G contracts between, you know, Nokia and Ericsson and Huawei. And so pointing out that, you know, doing some sort of evaluation that way. I don't know if that's really the right comparison. It's not really about the number of contracts. It's about the size of those contracts, the revenue associated. So if we think about, you know, this whole issue about Huawei not being able to compete in countries like the US, like Australia, okay, that's not good, but there's still quite a dominant position in China. And in fact, China has gone ahead and made it much more difficult for Ericsson and Nokia to get contracts in China. And believe me, those contracts from a size standpoint are much bigger than anything you know, that Nokia or Ericsson might be winning in, say, Estonia or, you know, even larger countries. So you can tally contracts all you want, but it's really the size of those contracts and the value of those contracts that I think it really comes down to. Then there's the issue, the point was made that, you know, this collaboration between the government and the military seemed to depict this as a uniquely Chinese thing. But if you look at any country, in fact, if you look at the US, I think, Greg, probably you have much better sense than I do about this, but look at the reign of Mr. Ashton Carter, right? I mean, that guy was all over Silicon Valley, and he had, you know, Eric Schmidt from Google doing consulting for the Department of Defense. So that to me is a pretty close connection between the military complex and the high tech arena, right? So I don't think that China is such a unique, I mean, we tend to put China in that realm and say, there's all this, like it's something unique. But I don't think that that's the case at all. I think this is a normal state of affairs. And yet we tend to put China on a pedestal and say that, well, you know, the Chinese, they're doing all this collaboration between the military and their high tech companies. And so, well, the US doesn't do anything different, I don't think. And the same goes for regulations. I mean, the Chinese regulating, you know, there's reference made to regulations of, you know, Chinese government and how they sort of guide and control companies. This is happening in the US at this point, right? I mean, the fact that Biden has seen fit to bring on people like Tim Wu into the government means that there's going to be some change in regulation and the stance of the government relative to high-tech companies that maybe won't go as far as the Chinese, but I'm sure there are plenty of people in Biden's government who are looking at the Chinese as a test case and saying, what can we learn from this and how do we apply this? So yeah, if we look at ground zero, where we are today, it looks like the Chinese are doing all this control and regulation of the high-tech industry. But I think that isn't, you know, it will come to the US soon enough and to the EU. So anyway, those are, you know, just a couple of more specific points. I think also there was sort of a gloss over on the EU, that the EU is sort of regarded as a region in the paper, but the EU, you know, has a lot of different constituents, right? So you get Poland and Hungary, which are very, very different in their stance politically, socially, culture, you know, relative to Germany, for example. Or so, and that sort of influences their strategy on technology and on things like 5G and how they relate to China, specifically. Anyway, I'll shut up here and just close, but those are a couple of observations I had. I think, you know, on the whole, I think the paper's fine. And I think for what it is, it does a very good job and it's well laid out. And so, you know, I just make a couple of points here that, you know, for consideration to be taken as or not as is appropriate.
So that's wonderful observations, Paul. Thank you very much. And I think the paper is in final stage. We cannot go, and also not only because it's in final stage, I think that the scope of paper expanded hugely, but we don't want to go to every topic. However, I think the points are very valid, and they could be raised as questions. They could be added to certain points, acknowledging that there is a wider strategy here, and this is part of it that's maybe beyond the scope. So I think it's very important if you please add your points, even if places where you feel that they could be something injected or added, would add value. I appreciate if you do that, but I think all of that, even in conclusion, we can raise as questions, or we can point out that this is the study and direction to go. I'm not sure if we will go to scenario building, because I'm not sure they could do it. But Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, my impression is similar to yours. I think that on your first and third comments, Paul, those are both very good. And it seems to me they're probably the most we can do is identify those as larger questions that are at the edges of our analysis, right? That the whole question of Chinese participation in standard setting bodies is exemplified by 5G, but also goes well beyond it. Ditto for people, that 5G raises the issue of not just of technology, but of the people to operate and create it. I think we can sort of flag that issue. Similarly, it seems to me as we talk about the relations with Chinese companies and the government, we ought to be a little sensitive to the pros to make sure we don't draw too stark a contrast. Now, I think there are differences in the sense that even Ash Carter and the Pentagon were mostly consumers and collaborators with Silicon Valley, not yet demandeurs or controllers or regulators. That may come, but we're not quite there yet. I think I agree with Patty that it'd be great to do some scenarios about the future, but that probably is a bridge too far for this paper and for its authors. I think they've done an awfully good job, I think, of laying out kind of the technology. So I think of this as a kind of primer plus, and probably doing scenarios and thinking too much about the future would take it in a direction that probably is I think a bridge too far. But thank you for reading it so carefully, Paul.
Yeah, no, and thanks for the feedback on both counts. I mean, I agree 100% with what you're saying, and that was sort of the intent of the first part of what I was saying, was that I think it is a really solid paper. I think it hits all the key notes. Whether it's the technology, the geopolitics, it's a solid piece of work, and it's well documented. And I think the writing is good. The transitions from one section to the next, it's all good. So the other points here maybe are, as you say, Greg, if we think about it, sort of at the edges of this one, right? So, or Perry, maybe that's what you were calling questions to be considered, but a little bit outside of the scope of what the intent of this is. And what it's, where it stands at this point. Absolutely 100% agree. I mean, I'd be happy, Pari, if you think it's of use to just add, a couple of these points at the end for consideration, however they're taken, either, as a future looking thing, down the road considered, or not, as the case may be. But I'll be happy to just, write a couple of those notes up at the end, or, within a separate document if it's helpful. No problem.
No, if we add it to the existing document, I appreciate. And then I think in terms of scenario building and other points, it could be always an article that we could write. I'm not sure if I can ask Leo and Echo to write it. I think it's beyond their capacity. But I think we ourselves could write as a follow-up, a paper, even, with you, Greg, we can write an article, lay down some of the issues we're discussing, and add a scenario building kind of component to it, which I think would be interesting. We can discuss that. But with this one, I appreciate if you put your points on the paper and we make sure that they're addressed in some way, maybe as a question, as pointing out, so that I think would improve the value of the paper a lot.
Okay, no, I can do that, sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the next issue I want to discuss today, since we don't have many reports to discuss, is the proposal we're writing about China. I had meeting with Eduardo. We discussed the use of NLP and AI and ML. However, after our meeting with people that we are giving the proposal to, it came clear that the budget, at least at the first stage, should be much smaller. So we are thinking about maybe 150, 200,000 budget for the first project. And Eduardo, I wonder how much NLP we can add to the project considering this budget. But the budget would be, basically, we would treat it as a proof of concept for larger project. So I think there's a room maybe by involving university to add these components. What do you think, Eduardo?
Yeah, as long as it's done as a proof of concept, then the budget goes down dramatically, because essentially you would just have to create a research design and hand it over to a data scientist, and there's plenty out there that are willing to be involved in a project, especially if it has some experimental aspect to it at a reduced cost, reduced pay. So in that case, I would take a portion part. Are you saying 150 to 200,000 for the whole thing, and then a portion for the? So maybe within $40,000 or $50,000, you can create a very basic proof of concept that points to potential further discoveries that could be made in that direction. And yes, at that point, you'd probably want to work with a university department as well.
Bring the costs down and involve interns and etc. That's what I thought. Thank you. So what I would do again, as we were planning at the beginning, once we finish it, especially the cost part, but generally, I will share the document with you, and maybe we could have more input in terms of how to pitch it. But yeah, hopefully by starting this, then we can get larger project for a more substantial research. Any comment, Greg?
No, just a word about the structure. As I said, we've sort of scaled back our ambition given our conversations with the would-be sponsors, which is the Office of Net Assessment at the Pentagon. And their sort of average project is in the 200K range. So that we took that as a kind of constraint. What we'll do is lay out the outline of a full project, which would go across capabilities, influence, stability, and intentions, but then we'll focus on the stability piece, which seems like the piece of most interest, where the question is, are there possible things going on inside Chinese society, good or bad, that might lead to phase changes that should dramatically affect our view of China as a competitor as we look forward. So that's kind of the question we're aiming at. And if we could, as we look at those stability questions, look at key groups and attitudes using some of the techniques you've worked with, Eduardo, that would be terrific. Anyway, that's our current plan, is to sort of lay out what could be a much bigger project, and maybe we can do the other phases at other times, but then focus on the stability chunk, but use some of these techniques as a proof of concept.
Yeah, I get that, and that's usually how it works. Funding agencies, they prefer to have that appetizer first before they order the main course.
Right.
So there's ways that you can make sure that the appetizer is really good and tantalizing. Yeah, and especially I think that's where the creative part is in research design. So you emphasize what could be done, so that you're not spending that much money on actually hiring a large squad of engineers and coming up with something that runs on a constant basis. But the packaging, I think, is what is important, because the technologies are there. And if you create this sort of proof of concept in a way that you're focusing on what the technologies can do with just a small taster of what they're doing. So maybe instead of probably focusing on 25 different themes like we were discussing last time over the past 5 years, you just choose maybe 5 over the past year. And then that would give an example of, oh, wow, you can project and forecast fluctuations in future sentiment in a general population around this and that theme. So maybe you can then extrapolate to others.
Yeah. Eduardo, I was thinking about 3 groups of population. One was the army personnel, The other one was the police force leader, personnel. And the third one was general public. Do you think we can accommodate 3 of them in this, or should we just go for general public, considering the budget and limitation we have?
I would go with one more specific, like the military personnel, especially since it's a huge population in itself, and there's a lot of military blogs in China. Incidentally, I used some Chinese military blogs to be able to forecast North Korean military provocations. So there's, I would focus on one small thing that then can give an example of what you can do with the others. The general population, I'd stay away with a small budget because it's so varied. So the more focused, the more specific, I think the better.
Sounds like good advice. Thank you.
So now, is there any projects, anything? Puram, would you like to discuss anything?
I'm fine, Pari. I mean, what I've been doing at the moment is that I'm trying to talk to, a few publishers for the project which I'm trying to develop. And I think by the next week or the week after, I should be able to pass on to you and to all the colleagues about the developments which are going to take place. But I think my talks with them so far have been pretty encouraging, and I should be able to give you some leg up by next week or the week thereafter. So this is the one thing. The second one is that about the project which we were talking about. I mean, I would really like to say 2 quick things. One is that, in my experience, whenever there is a larger project being planned, we usually try and keep it as one big pie. But within that one big pie, we try to cut it into 2 or 3 pieces, which means that, we are beginning with one piece of the pie. And then there are 2 other pies which are also interrelated. So that, unless you take the pie 1, you cannot go to the pie 2. And unless you take pie 1 and pie 2, you cannot really go to the pie 3. And that doesn't really complete the cake. So I would really say that would be a good idea to lay the project proposal in such a way that it sort of, highlights the overall scenario or situation, but then we, cut it into the pieces and say that a piece A or 1 is very important as a primary factor before we really go to the piece B or C. I think that would be another area, the idea, which could be thought through so that, while one could be happy with a primary kind of research on the topic that we were talking about, but it won't really get complete until unless we have the pie B completed, and then following that, the pie C completed. So that would be the kind of an approach which I think would also be considered, provided it sort of, fits into the overall agenda and how we are really going to think through, and then take it up one by one.
That's good. Thank you, Puram.
Yeah, so is there anything anyone wants to discuss? No? Well, then we have a short meeting again. I wish everybody a wonderful week ahead and see you next week.
Have a good week, everybody. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.